Welcome back to our series Meeting Jesus, as we've been working our way through the Gospel according to Mark and getting to know Jesus and the movement he's pulled us into a little bit better, a little more deeply. We made a turn last week into chapter 8 of Mark's Gospel, and we sort of teased toward the end this critical turning point in the story as Mark tells it, where Jesus approaches his disciples and asks them this central question: who do you say that I am? But I'm going to ask us to back up and re-enter that story and maybe get a little more wisdom from the scenes that Mark bookends that important conversation with. A middle section of Mark's Gospel that might not emerge if you only read it in little snippets like we're used to hearing it on Sunday mornings. But if you read as a whole, that structure, that whole concept, the whole idea Mark's trying to convey sort of emerges a little more clearly. So I want to ask you to go back in time with me. And before we go all the way back to the first century, I want to ask you to go back to the late 1980s, early 1990s. When there was this fad of artwork that were called 3D stereograms. Remember those? They were sometimes called magic eye images, and they were kind of computer generated and somehow woven into this pattern that at first looked abstract. When you stared at it and you kind of let your eyes unfocus, I'd always have to take my glasses off and just kind of let my eyes unfocus, you would see this other image sort of emerge out of the picture. It had been there all along, but something in your brain, something in the ways your eyes worked, required you to sort of unfocus and just sort of stare, and then this 3D image would pop out of the pattern, and it had been there all along. Nothing had changed with the original image, but all of a sudden there it was. And I can remember the first time seeing one of those, going, it's just a bunch of random dots, and then going, oh my goodness, there's a circus tent there, oh my goodness, there's a lion there, and you could see it, and it felt like it was leaping off of the page or off of the wall. Something like that sort of two-stage, sort of I see it but I don't see it, and then all of a sudden I see with clarity, actually happens in Mark's storytelling as people come to see Jesus more clearly. There's this fascinating way that Mark does this. He'll sometimes take a really important idea and bookend it on either side with stories that sort of complement each other, and almost like a sandwich, enclose this center part. We saw that earlier in Mark's Gospel in the really interesting way he tells the story of Jairus' daughter, the synagogue leader's daughter, and then the woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years. The story begins with the man comes to Jesus, help my daughter. On his way, there's this woman who touches Jesus, the fringe of his cloak, and she's healed. In the meantime, Jairus' daughter dies, and Jesus says, well, let's go help anyway, and he raises her from the dead as sort of this bookend, and both of those stories are now bound together because the way Mark has told it with a bookending and then this part in the middle. Well, something similar happens, and it's almost like Mark was getting us ready earlier. Hey, I'm gonna do this sometimes. So now as we turn into Mark chapter 8, there's a scene where Jesus heals a man of blindness. He's able to restore his sight, and it's weird because it feels like it takes two tries. Jesus heals him. He makes mud with spit and dirt on the ground and puts it on his eyes, and at first the man goes, well, I can kind of see things, but people are moving around and they're kind of like trees. And then Jesus does a second round of healing, and his sight is completely restored. Now, what's weird at first is we've never encountered a story where Jesus has to like try again to heal somebody. And I don't think Mark is saying that Jesus was just having a bad day or an off experience. I don't think the point is to say Jesus has the fault, but rather to say, you know what, sometimes healing is gradual. Sometimes getting clarity and vision is gradual. And that's important to know because there's going to come another healing of sight story coming up a little bit later in chapter 10, where Jesus heals a man who's blind, whose name is Bartimaeus, and he heals him just instantly, one try. There's no phases, there's no stages, there's no gradual. So it's sort of clear Jesus is able to heal people just instantaneously. But here's this moment where Mark gives us the story of a sort of in progress sort of healing, from nothing to I can kind of see but it's blurry and people are like trees, to final clarity. And in between those stories, those two different stories of healing, the man with sort of two phases of being able to see, and then the blind Bartimaeus who's able to have his sight restored instantaneously, there's this middle section where Jesus has this conversation with his disciples. Who do you say that I am? And Peter blurts out, you are the Messiah. And Jesus goes, don't tell anybody that. Why? Not because he's wrong, right? Mark has said from the opening verse of his gospel, I'm telling you the story of Jesus, the Messiah. He's the Son of God, right? So Mark has laid his cards on the table from the beginning and has given us other voices, God's own voice, the voices of the evil spirits, other people who recognize Jesus all along. The question is, what does it mean? What do you see when you picture the word Messiah? And the trouble is, for Peter, for all of his other disciples, for just about everybody else, when they hear the word Messiah, they already have a preconceived notion in their mind, and basically it's conquering king. It's somebody who's going to take the fight to the Romans and take their country back for God, and we're going to raise up an army with weapons, and we're going to kill our enemies, and anybody we think has sold out to the Romans, we're going to go get them. Jesus hasn't come to be that. For people who expected the Messiah to be this guardian of moral purity, giving out new rules and commandments so we could avoid touch or contact with those sinners or those impure people, Jesus hasn't come to be that either. Jesus hasn't come to command angel armies or shoot laser beams out of his eyes. Mark is convinced Jesus hasn't come to kill or destroy at all, but to save and redeem, even at the cost of losing his own life, of being killed, of being crucified. That's the way Jesus is God's Messiah. It's this completely upside down picture. And so Peter and the other disciples themselves have sort of this two-stage restoration of their sight. It's taken the first 8 chapters to get to the point of even going, oh, Jesus is the one we've been waiting for. Jesus is the Messiah. But the moment they say that, Jesus has to say, okay, but it's not what you're picturing. Let's go a little bit further and let me clarify. Jesus not only has to get them to recognize, yes, he's the one they've been waiting for, but then he has to help them unlearn all that they thought they knew, all the things they had pictured the Messiah doing, to get new kind of clarity, to see him rightly. Because the moment Peter says, you're the Messiah, Jesus stops him and goes, and let me tell you, the Son of Man, him pointing to himself, the Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of the respectable religious people and the politically powerful people and be crucified and then rise from the dead. This is my way of being the Messiah. So the cross isn't an accident or mistake or derailing God's plan. It is exactly God's way of being the Messiah. But that's a pretty radical change of vision, right? If all your life you've been told God's Messiah is coming, and when the Messiah comes, he will slaughter our enemies, and he will bring glory and greatness and wealth and power and status to us, and you want to get in on that movement from the ground floor so you can have a place of power beside the Messiah, and Jesus comes along hanging out with the nobodies and healing people who are sick and speaking words of hope to people, and then saying, oh, and by the way, I'm going to die. My central way of embodying God's reign is not conquering or killing, but suffering, self-giving love that is willing even to be crucified. And as we'll hear Jesus say later on, giving his life like a ransom for many. It's so unexpected. It feels kind of like watching one of those stereograms, one of those magic eye pictures where you're staring at it, and at first I see something, but then it pops out at you and you realize it had been there all along. Mark does that in this middle section of the gospel, with these healing stories and this conversation with his disciples in the middle. And it's worth seeing how all those together are part of Mark's storytelling, because that's important. Jesus' followers then aren't people who always automatically get it, like we immediately have answers to all of our questions, but rather we're people who grow and learn and sometimes gradually come to understand more deeply about Jesus. This is a really important picture, not just about Jesus, but about the disciple community. That it's okay when we struggle and stumble and sometimes don't get it. It's okay that we bear with each other when each of us has growing edges or ways that we're still stumbling through, struggling through. There's going to be times we get it wrong. My goodness, Simon Peter himself, right? This central hero of the early church doesn't get it and can't understand that Jesus' way of being the Messiah isn't the conquering king, but the suffering servant. So if the first 12 disciples of Jesus who were there and seen it all in person struggle and stumble, and it's okay when we struggle and stumble and it takes a while for us to grow into seeing Jesus clearly. There's hope for us, there's grace for us in this story too, in this section of Mark's gospel, because in so many ways we're the people who are gradually having our eyes opened as well. As we continue on through the Gospel of Mark, we're going to continue to see clarity about Jesus as he insists with his disciples who he is and how he lives God's role of Messiah out unexpectedly in ways they weren't envisioning or what they weren't prepared for. But also we're going to see Jesus bears with his disciples throughout this whole time, and that they're the ones so often who think they have the answers and have to unlearn them and then go, oh, now I see more clearly. It was there all along, but my eyes weren't ready to see it. That's the conversation we're going to be exploring this coming Thursday as we continue our study through Mark, continuing at the end of Mark chapter 8 and moving on forward. We invite you to be a part of these conversations as we meet at 1 o'clock in person on Thursdays at Community of Christ, but you can also join us online with these summary conversations as well. But keep meeting Jesus with us along the way. See you next time.